Hello and welcome back to awtoolbox.com. My name is Glenn Keller, and in this video we are finishing up our Teamcenter installation. We're going to be focusing on what happened during the deployment, specific log locations we can look at, and then how we can get the Teamcenter environment fully up and running now that the deployment is successful. So in here you can see in the last video we left off by running the deployment. And you can see that it has finished up here. In the deployment, it has worked through all of the deployment components, the package builds, and each of the database updates that were required. So at the bottom, you're looking for the deployment script has executed successful. If you have any errors, note that in the deployment location where you executed the deploy.bat from, you have a deployer log in here, as well as so this log will be kind of the output from the execution. It'll have the generic installation log that we're used to with the TEM and any errors that may have come into that. The scanner log will give you information about the different components, and then the utility logs will provide additional clarification on what has actually occurred. Now, in addition to those, you can also check the installation directory. And so after the success, if we come into the TC root, Teamcenter 24.2, TC root, you can see everything has been installed here. And you can go into the install folder. And in the install folder, there will be a install log source file here. This, if I open it with code, will be that same kind of execution log that gives you the output from the run. So you can see this one lists out all the features that were being installed, any potential issues, jar files, and the completion statement. So now that the installation has completed, we have a couple of things we want to check. In here, I'm going to go ahead and close my monitoring software. Basically the task manager performance. And then I'm going to close this out. A couple of things that we get right off the get-go. You can see there's a Teamcenter 2412 icon here. The Teamcenter 24 icon is the two-tier Rich Client, which we've installed, and it gets put in this TC root portal directory. And what that icon is this portal.bat file. There is a start portal file in Linux. Either way, this file will run the two-tier client, and at this point, as long as the database connects, the two-tier client should connect to the database server. So I'm going to go ahead and run the two-tier client. It will launch, and you'll get, because it's a two-tier, as it's launching in your details in the task manager, if you sort by name, go to Java, you'll see a couple of things listed. So one will be this TCCS file. This is your FCC cache. It is the Teamcenter Client Communication System, and this needs to be running for a Rich Client to communicate back and forth to the FMS system. This is required for pushing and pulling files from that client. The other Javas that are listed here are related to the microservices. So you can see a lot of those. You can also see things like the deployment center web server. This is your TC Vault service. This is the deployment center web server. And then this is the Rich Client itself. In addition to that, if we go to the T's, the TC server executable is the Rich Client's access to interacting with the database. And then these two, the TC service executables that are down here, are essentially processes that may be trying to connect but are hung. So these may not be necessary, and we'll take a look at that. The Teamcenter executable file is the application itself, and then you can see we have the deployment center files. So let's just go ahead and log in. I'm going to use my base administrative user. I haven't created any other users. And the one thing I do notice right away in 2412 is it has not updated my Rich Client web server to say Teamcenter Training. We have tried to get it to update with this, but it doesn't update this setting here. So we're going to leave it at tceng1 and click login. So what we're expecting is this to just log in, and you can see it popped up a little prompt that said synchronizing the Rich Client files. That typically means that the FMS system is working and that it is able to reach out and grab that data. The Teamcenter Products Excellence program will come up like we see it in the requests for the install. I'm just going to hit decline in my case, but again, to each his own, there's no functional difference there. At this point, the client should open. It does take a second for this Rich Client to initialize Java and get all started up. But in here, I should be able to come in. There is an application you can access through either that Add Applications button or Open Perspective. Go to Other, and then you have the Organization app here. What we're looking for is access to the volume. So in the bottom area, if I expand volumes and select the default volume, as long as the data looks right and populates here with no error, you have access to the volume. In addition to that, it's probably a good practice to just validate that you can download something. So I like to take a text document, create a new text document in here, and call this spec. And then in the text document, I'll just edit it real quick. I'm going to add some data. Save that and close it. So at this point, we have some data in there, and we're going to drag and drop it onto the home folder, and it should create the data set. Hit OK. And at that point, we have tested the FMS system. If we right-click the data set and choose Named References, you can see that the file is there, and we could download it, put it into our desktop location, download, and see how it tries to overwrite. So it updates that file. So we have tested the Rich Client now. We know that that's functional. I'm just going to go ahead and close out of it. And now we can test the other components. So we do know that we have a database connection, but one of the other tests that we typically do is coming into the Start menu when it opens up. And then we'll come down to the Teamcenter 2412, and you can see there's the Environment Manager, which is the older installation tool instead of Deployment Center. And then we have the two-tier Rich Client, and then we have a Teamcenter command prompt. Now this command prompt is a little different than a standard command prompt. So I'm going to run the command prompt as administrator. And in here, a couple of things that I like to run just to validate everything is working. Install-ayt. This utility basically asks, are you there? And if you get site is already installed, it will fail. So a couple of reasons why it may fail and get a different message is the database is down, the listener is down, or maybe you can't communicate to the database. In addition to that, this utility to check the Teamcenter to database connection relies on a file in this Teamcenter 2412 folder called TC Profile Vars, and that exists in this TC data location. Every site only has one TC data location. You may have copied the TC data to other servers to give access to the location, but the source is the corporate server. This represents the data model and all the elements that you have installed. And if I come in here and select T and scroll down a little, TC Profile Vars is right here. I'm going to choose Open with Code. And what we're looking for in this file is the database server. So the database server connection, the Oracle SID is important here. And then if you look around a little bit, TCDB connect is an environment variable that we used to have in this file that would define the connection to that database server. If I do a control find and say TCDB connect, you can see it's right here. TCDB connect, TCDB server, and Oracle SID are all provided here, and you can notice that it replaces the file in TC data, so this is a template directory. And if we scroll up, it calls out these values. But again, one thing that I'm used to seeing is this right here. And right now, it doesn't have a password set for it. Typically, it would have some type of an encrypted password string. So this needs to be correct for it to identify. And what I'm going to do is just see in 2412 what happens. We know install AYT works just fine, so now I'm going to run list users, which actually establishes a session and shows me some data. So it's another level of testing. Let's go ahead and do info-dba, DBA. And once it runs, you can see it logs in and gives me exactly what I need. There is an import, export, reports utility where you can give an export flag and a specific name of a report in the system that has a style sheet that you can run that will test the FMS system through the command prompt as well. But once this connects, it's basically there. Just note that the TCDB connect statement still doesn't have a password in it. So at this point, we have tested the Rich Client and the command prompt, and both are working. Now, if I try and come into the active workspace environment and launch a browser window, the active workspace environment is installed in a default port that we chose called 3000. So if I do training 01 3000, which is the hosted gateway port, and hit enter, you will see that I get the active workspace login page. In here, if I attempt to log in as well, you can see that I get a 404 error. So a couple of things about this is the install may have installed all the components, but there are a couple of additional steps that you need to do in the software to get it up and running. If we go to the services, you can see that there are a couple of services created now. We have the Access Manager Read Expression Manager service, which is an optional start after the fact. We have the dispatcher components all running. The FSC that controls the write access or the readability of files downloaded from the server back to the client, that's right here. The indexing service is not turned on yet. We do need to test that still. And then we have the process manager service, which is actually providing us access to this URL. So the process manager service is our microservices service, and this is what controls and provides access to the gateway. Then we have our revision configuration accelerator service, which we can optionally turn on, and the suggestion builder service, which we can optionally turn on for the Teamcenter or Active Workspace Assistant. And then finally our Vault service for securing the Teamcenter access. In addition to that, we have our Wildfly service, which is our web application server. Other web application servers include Tomcat or JBoss. This is just one of the many. IIS is another one, .NET. So in here, I need to deploy my 4-tier components to my web application server. If I come in here, this 404 error, I can go into the More Tools, Developer Tools section of my browser. And in the console, in these tools, it'll say it failed to access TC REST services, which is basically just saying that it can't get to our web application server. So if I come in, what we're going to do is deploy the WAR files that it had built us because we built it in Deployment Center. Let's go into Deployment Center to start with and just kind of recap where these settings are. Inside of Deployment Center in Environments, if we come down to the applications or components, we'll go to components in this case, you'll see that we have the 4-tier, which is Active Workspace is a 4-tier component, but we have the 4-tier web server or web application files that we want to deploy right here. So the output of this Teamcenter web tier, Java EE or .NET, goes to the Teamcenter root location in Teamcenter 2412, TC root in our case. And then down in there, we have the web folder. And in the web folder, we have the Teamcenter folder and deployment folder. And that's our TC WAR file. This will also include your single sign-on services, the TC login and TC identity services, if you were to configure those, as well as any additional WAR files that may need to be built for any add-ons. So the goal of this is to take this and deploy it out to our web tier. So I'm going to take this file and choose copy, and then I'm going to go to my apps, and in the apps location under Wildfly, we've previously configured Wildfly to be able to be run, and take a look at our blog posts. We have a full tutorial on how to set up Wildfly or JBoss. But go to the standalone folder, deployments, and basically paste that WAR file. And you'll see in a moment, since the Wildfly app is up and running as a service, it'll begin to deploy it with this is deploying file. And once it's done, it'll switch over to is deployed. So now it is deployed, and we want to keep both of those there. One trick here is if you're working with JBoss or Wildfly, if you're creating backups of the TC WAR files, do not store your backups in this directory. It will attempt to deploy them, and because of that, it will fail. So now that we have this here, if you're working with .NET, you do need to go into the information or the IIS interface. So in here under administrative tools, IIS could be inside of this location. If I do IIS, you'll notice I don't have it. If I do .NET, I don't have it. So those aren't actually installed until I configure them. So in here, I've got that deployed. Everything should be good. I'm going to minimize this, go back to my active workspace window, and now I'm just going to click login again. This time, if you watch, we get a post failure, and this time it's failing because it cannot get a server assignment because none of the server managers are online. This error is relative to another service, and if I come into the T's, you can see that I do not have a server manager installed. Now, the server manager is this component right here, and there's actually a little trick to this. It's very simple, but we forgot to select service versus command line. So we can come in here and flip this switch and generate a new package, run the deploy sequence again to update that. Or B, we can test it first and make sure it works and then come through and do that other update. So I'm going to choose the second one. I'm going to come in here, and what we're looking for is in that TC root location, which is inside of Siemens 2412, TC root. There is a pool manager folder, and in the pool manager folder, we have a configs folder. Configuration 1, and then in here is this mgr start. So this is the command line equivalent to the server manager. If I come in and I copy the path here, and then I come into here, which is my administrative Visual Studio Code environment, I could also run this in a command prompt. I'm going to cd, let's make sure we don't modify the TC profile vars. I'm going to cd to that directory, and then in there I'm going to say mgr start and execute it. And notice it's yelling because there is a environment variable, the FOSS repository is not installed. So I'm going to exit out of this for the time being, and let's try that again in our command prompt. So if I come in here, right click a regular command prompt, run as administrator, or I guess this was the Teamcenter one, and then I cd to that directory. mgr start is what I'm aiming at. I could have run .bat in the other one. I think that was my mistake. I ran the other file. So make sure you get the supported file type for your installation. But what I'm looking for in the server manager is if I go to the task manager, now that it's running, You can see it's got some server counts in here, warming, warm. These are server processes that'll be awaiting a connection from my users. So no more do we need a local TC server process to be running. Everything is hosted from that server. If I go to the task manager, details, go to the T's, you'll see there's 3 of these up and running. I do still have these 2 broken TC_service executables. These are essentially broken. Anytime you see that, they can be basically just deleted. So these 3, if I delete one, the system will automatically spin up a new one. So you'll see a 3rd one pop up if everything is working correctly. If I delete this one and delete this one, notice that I'm not getting additional TC server processes. So in here, anytime that you see those and they're not popping up, that is typically the case. Something is going wrong with that. So I'm going to Control-C, close that out, and then run it one more time. Now that all the hung processes are down. So now, if I come down, we'll take a look at the Teamcenter side, and we'll see if it spins up some new TC server processes. There they are. So they spun new ones up. Now at that point, if I delete one, I should get another one popping up here in a few minutes. But let's go ahead while we wait for that 3rd one to pop and try and log into the Active Workspace window. So in here, I'm going to open this up and then we're going to log in. And at this point, you'll see that it actually logs in. I get kind of a better update in libraries that are downloading, so I can close my console. And now I can use the Explorer, navigate around, and just make sure the interface is working okay for Active Workspace. It may take a little bit as it's building some caches in the browser when it first starts moving around. But as long as you get the response from the client, data is loading, and you get these style sheets over on the right-hand side where data shows, then everything's working. The style sheet's rendered through FMS, so I know the FMS is working if the style sheet is loading. There are a couple of additional features inside of this client that we want to test. So we had actually installed visualization as well as indexing. So what we're going to do is just kind of shift off and make sure that indexing and visualization are ready to go. Then we'll come back in and make sure that all the services are running optimally, and then we'll restart the box to make sure everything comes up appropriately. So at this point, we're going to minimize the manager console. So this needs to stay running if you want Active Workspace running. We'll move this over to a service here soon. At this point, we can move forward, and let's go ahead and play with the search first, and then we'll get into Viz. I'm going to go ahead and move my task manager out of the way, and I'm going to click on this. Inside of this folder, what we're looking at with Indexer is this search up across the top of the page. So this search runs on the Solar server. If I hit the search button and I do a search, let's do 00 star, it will run a query against the Solar server. Now the Solar server, if I come in and say training 01, 8983 Solar, this is the Solar server. The Solar server is a service that is running, and it's one of the few that's not grouped with the Teamcenter section. It's the Active Workspace Indexing service. If I shut this off and refresh the browser, I'll get A404. If I turn this back on and restart the browser, do a search, I don't get an error message because that's up and running, as long as it started up before I hit the search button. Oh, there's the error message, so it didn't start up fully. If that service is down, you will get this error. That means Solar is down and it can't contact it. So let me do a search again and see if it picks up on it. And you can see I didn't get an error because the service has been started. So just because you don't get an error here and there's no data doesn't mean that there's an error with the installation. It could just mean that you haven't indexed your data yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here and start the Solar environment. So I'm going to refresh and I'm going to log in. Our credentials we gave it were solar_admin info_dba. I'm going to log in and then I can check to see if anything's been indexed by coming down and going to the collection 1. And you'll notice there's 0 information in here. So that just means that you haven't indexed that database to be searchable. I'm going to go ahead and favorite the main page of Solar. So I'm going to come here and hit bookmark. And I'm going to just change it to Solar and hit done. So now I have Solar, Deployment Center, and the doc server all set up, and I'm ready to test this out. I'm going to go ahead and just pretend like I don't know what's going on. And I do know that there's this Teamcenter Global Search indexing service sitting here that isn't running yet. We chose to not start it. If I start it and it stays up, then what that's going to do is potentially go in and index the data that needs to be indexed for the system. So I'm going to hit this little green refresh button once or twice and make sure it stays up. And then what I'm going to look for is in the operating system, if I come to Teamcenter and then go to the TCFTS indexer folder, I'm going to come into logs. And the indexer tool that's running and picking up on new data, that is going to be this TCFTS indexer log or the OBJ data log. Now, there are a lot of other types of indexing you can do. Admin data indexing, file content indexing. You can do structure indexing to optimize bombs. Object data would be the primary part of that tool. If I open this with code, you'll see that it's beginning to connect. And this is a really good kind of analysis as to what's going on. So if I select in here, you can see that it has attempted to pick up on new objects. But since nothing has been indexed in the past, then there isn't anything to pick up on. Nothing has been indexed, so nothing has changed. So I'm going to close this, and let's just go ahead and clean up the rest of those files. Minimize this, and what I want to do is I'm going to run a utility to index my system. Now, with that other service running, it probably won't work, but the utility exists in TCFTS indexer bin. It's this TCFTS indexer utility right here. It's a little bat file. So I'm going to cd to that directory in a command prompt. Don't need a Teamcenter command prompt for this, but since it's the one I have, there is no problem with using it. I'm going to cd to that directory, and then I'm going to say run tcfts indexer.bat-task equals obj data index. And what this is going to do is basically just go through your settings back to time and pick up on anything that may need indexed in the system. If this runs very, very quickly with no errors, it just means that your date range isn't set correctly. So in this case, the object data flow is already running, and that means that the service needs to be stopped. And that's part of the reason we didn't start it right off the get-go. So now, if I run it again, you'll see that this should, as long given barring any errors, go in and begin to communicate. It's setting the max connections that it needs to do this. It downloaded the files. One quick tool here is if you see this data model is 64, it means that it is working FMS-wise. And then it's going through and it's going to query a whole bunch of data in your date range, and then it's going to export that data, transform it, and then load it into the Solar environment. You can physically watch this happen if you come into the collection 1 in Solar, hit a refresh. As it begins to load data, you'll see this begin to populate. In here, you can see that it finished already, and I don't have any data. You can see errors. Error is right here. Error. Okay, so you're looking for 5 zeros on the errors. That means that it completed. You can see information about each step along the way and what all it queried for. Now, in this case, I know that if I refresh this, I have 49 objects that are now returned. So 49 objects, if I come into Teamcenter and do a search here, I should get at least something returned. You can see some out-of-the-box data has been returned. So I know that my search and my index is now working, and now I need to test my sync. So with that index being complete, which means that I got a new line, I'm going to come back in and I'm going to start the indexing service. So the indexing service is going to run what's called a sync. It's going to go in and pick up new data as data is modified or manipulated. I'm going to come into my Explorer, and then in my home folder, in my new stuff folder, which I'll expand down, think of it as a placeholder for new data that you want to create. I'm going to come up to the top and choose New, Add from the ... menu, and I'm going to create a simple item. Give it a name. I'm going to call this Test Training Item 01 and hit Add. This will create a new element. It'll put it inside of my new stuff folder. Now this object is indexed, and we'll go into indexing settings more in the BMIDE courses and more in the indexing in deep dive courses, but basically this creates a new object. If I do a search for 23, so just 23, I'm looking to see if the search picks up on that. At the moment, it has not. So if I wait long enough and everything is working correctly, then I'll see it get picked up. You can also just come into the log directory in TC FTS Indexer logs, and in the log directory under OBJ data, I'm going to open this up. You can see that this has run over and over again every 60 seconds. So you can see it right here. And it's trying to pick up on any new data. You can see that it's running the query. So this is all the output from the other component. And now you can see down here, the sync has started from the service and it added one object. If it come down, it had loaded that one object and everything is good. So now, if I come back in here and hit the search, I don't see it. The reason I don't see it may be simply because it comes in with a 23 at the end, and I didn't have a star here at the beginning, so it did not return. So there are some search settings in here. If you hit ... search settings, where you can configure the wildcard entries and what you need. We'll go more into those in the fundamentals course. So in our case, we do know that it's picking up because we put 23 there. We're getting new data, so the indexer is working. Now in our deep dive, you're going to learn a little bit more about indexing. So inside of this TCFTS indexer folder, inside of the config directory, there is a TCS FTS indexer directory and then the OBJ data directory. These are properties files, and if I open them, you'll see that it has a start time defined for it, and it has an end time defined for it. So basically, it's just going back to this date and indexing anything from this date forward. You can also control various aspects of how it's moving the data, if it's running a specific query, batch size allocations, and much, much more inside of this file. Definitely take a peek at the other file, the TCFTS indexer file, which is kind of the parent to all the other variations. And this one will have your 4-tier URL. So this will define how it's talking to Teamcenter, and it is talking through an FS or a 4-tier connection in Wildfly. So now that that is completed, let's do kind of a bigger test on it. We have a set of sample data sitting inside of our media folder, and the sample data has realistic components to it. This sample data is required for testing the visualization data, as it has what are called JT files inside of it, full assemblies and things that we can fully test the indexer with. What we're going to do is import this data, and then once it's imported, that's new data created, and you should see the indexer pick up on that new data. So to do this, you can use Active Workspace if you need, or you can use Teamcenter. What you're looking for is an option to use a PLM XML import. I'm going to go to my Explorer window, and in my new stuff folder, I'm going to come up to the top, and I have specifically installed the PLM XML import exported component in Active Workspace. So if I choose New or Edit, you'll be looking for that option. So in here, it's pretty much always under this import export option down at the bottom. But in previous versions, if you're maybe taking the course and looking at 2312, it was in the share option at one of those versions. I can't remember if it's 2312 or 14. What I'm looking for is import PLM XML. So import PLM XML, choose File, and then I want that grinding assembly to be the file. Now what I'm really looking for here is this XML file. That's the input for it. So that input is actually one up. If I switch this to all files and choose open for the XML document, now I can say what transfer mode. Now you do need to configure a transfer mode still, and that gets us into the administrative components. So in Active Workspace, I'm not going to be able to do this just yet. I'm going to go ahead and launch that 2-tier Rich Client, which I can do while Active Workspace is running. So I'm going to launch that, and I'll import the utility through that. This also goes forward to show you that the indexer does work, even with data created inside of the Teamcenter Rich Client. So once this data is imported, we'll validate it in the Rich Client, and then we'll go to our indexer and make sure things are picking up the way it should, and we should see the data, and that'll lead us into testing the visualization system. This is opening up. So we have the Rich Client here. I'm simply going to go to the top. Now you can choose the new stuff folder, but go to the top and choose Tools, Import, PLM XML, and then in the PLM XML dialog, go find that file. So here's the file, hit open, and here is the list of transfer modes, and I just want the configured data import default. Hit apply, and you'll see down at the bottom corner, down here, there's an importing section that is basically telling me that this is getting put into the system. Now, while that's importing, our indexer tool is still running. So if I come into my Siemens Teamcenter 2412, TC root, and scroll down to that TCFTS indexer folder, in here I should have a nice set of logs, and the object data log is here. If I open this with code, you'll see way down at the bottom that the cycle has begun to add 23 objects. So I can physically see that there was 0 objects before I started that, and now there's 23 objects getting added. So if I go into Active Workspace and I do a search, I should have more data out of that search. So I'm going to come in and I'll do something that's not 100% recommended, which is a star search, but it does tell me how much is in the system. I'm starting to get some data like this bearing, this screw, some 3D data. Here's my custom grinding assembly. And if I look at the Teamcenter environment, you can see it's still kind of running that import. So more and more data is coming in. I'm going to go ahead and reopen that file, the object data file. Open it again with code. And just scroll down and you can see now it's got 63 objects, and then it modified a relationship to an already indexed object. So it's pulling more and more in. So in here, I am pretty much ready once this process completes to test out our visualization components. I'm going to go ahead while it finishes and move or close the solar environment, which you can see, by the way, before you do. If you refresh it, there's a lot more data in this collection 1 environment. So you know it's been indexed, and if I hit refresh again, after about 60 seconds, it should increase. Here's Deployment Center. I'm just going to get rid of those two, go back to solar. So what we're dealing with in visualization while we are awaiting this assembly to fully import is visualization in this version has a couple of things. You can open up an individual component. Notice this got an error during import. So if I hit yes on the log file, it'll say it was unable to find a property, but it was not stored in the error stack. So this is an item revision master property. This assembly was built in an older version. So if you get this error, your data is still in the system and you should be able to find it under the new stuff folder. You won't see it, but you can see that it is getting populated right here. It's this 090130 assembly. So if I come into Teamcenter and say 09013 star, I should get some good results out of the Rich Client. There's that assembly cutting head. If I open it in here, what I'm expecting to see is let's launch it in the Rich Client assembly. So I'm just going to double click this little red, blue, green icon. And it will launch it in Structure Manager for me. And what I'm looking for is the 3D components. So what you're going to click is this component right here, which is Hide Show Data Panel. Select it, and then in the graphics viewer, it will load up the visualization system. Now, in this case, I'm running on an unusable graphics device. I don't have anything mounted to this server. So because of this, you won't see the ability for this to run. I need to get OpenGL on the box if I want it to work in the Rich Client. So again, maybe an error message we tackle in our blog. In here, it is going to still attempt to load up that viewer view. May not block us in any way, shape, or form. And what you need to do is, once it's loaded, is check the box. So I'm going to check the top level box, which is going to give me access to all of the visualization components. I'm just going to say yes, and it should turn them all on and load the graphics. So you can see down at the bottom of the screen, it was loading, but nothing's really popping up. With that error message that launched, I wouldn't expect it, but I do see everything. If I go to attachments, you can see it's got this file, which is a JT direct model file. It's a JT file. If I right click it and choose named references, you can see it's got this right here, .jt. So it's basically a visualization data. I'm going to minimize this, and I'm going to go ahead and try and do the same thing in here. I'm just going to choose open on the object. And then when the assembly opens, let's go ahead and make this a little bit bigger here. I can choose 3D by pulling down this option and selecting 3D. This is a little different. It's not in the tabs across the top anymore. It's up across the top. And then when it loads up, I'll get this error. So this error specifically means that the Visualization Server Manager is not running. We haven't started it yet, so that makes sense. I'm going to close it. And one additional trick you can do if you don't have data to validate this is come to your user profile up at the top and switch to Active Admin. Active Admin will give you access to a tile called Viewer Administration. And Viewer Administration gives you access to view whether or not you can access this visualization server, whether or not it's on this machine or not. So in a moment when we start this, I should be able to see the components come through and then ultimately test. Now the visualization components are made up of two pieces. They are also deployed in TC Root, and they are called the Viz Assigner and the Viz Pool Manager. These have to be started Viz Assigner first, and then the Viz Pool Manager is what it assigns processes to, and the Viz Pool Manager will host a set of what are called Viz View executables. In here, to test them, we can just simply right-click and choose Run as Administrator, and it will run the Viz Assigner with that little underscore bat file. When it runs, this will be essentially what you get. This is the full output. Everything is good. If you need logs, go into the Jetty folder, and then in here you'll see an install service option to create this as a service. You will also see this etc folder with additional configurations if you need to tune your Jetty. The one thing that I do recommend is this Jetty service.properties file. If I open this file, it'll have configuration and tuning options, connection information related to your build. In here, the one thing is this max usage threshold. This doesn't really matter that much for the visualization assigner component, but for the Viz Manager component, that threshold blocks the additional 30% of your server CPU utilization. So you may need to bump this up to 0.9 depending on your specs. If I minimize this, I'm going to keep the Viz Assigner open, go back to TC Root, scroll down, and I have my Viz Pool Manager. In this case, I can see in my Task Manager that I do not have any Viz processes, except for this one Viz view, running on the system. And you can see that this one Viz view is kind of like a connection to it. So I'm going to run this one as administrator. And what you'll see is kind of in the background and the connection information, this should connect to the assigner and additional Viz views will now open. And you can see we've got it configured to run up to 8. So even though our server manager only runs roughly 3 processes. And because of that, you'll notice that I now have CPU utilization issues. So if you don't have that much RAM or components on the system, we can tune this. I'm going to Control C the prompt to properly destroy it. Control C. So now it shuts all those down. And I'm going to come into the Jetty folder to that same install service properties file. Open with code. And in here, notice the warm servers 8. My server can't hold that, so I'm going to set that to 3. So that's here on this line. And then down below that, I know that my max servers can only touch roughly 8, or it will top that out. And then if I save this, so I've saved it, I can try that again. So I'm going to come back into the File Explorer, go back to the Pool Manager, and now that I've downgraded what's running on it, I'm going to run this as admin. I still need to maybe tweak the threshold for utilization. So that is right here on this line 44 in this version. So you'll see it's still yelling about that 0.7 threshold. So I'll Control C it again. And then I'm going to change that 0.7 threshold to 0.9 for my instance. Now definitely pay attention to your specs in your computer for that task. So then I'm going to run this again, now that I've tuned it to 0.9. And if it's within the threshold, I should get a start. So in here, now it says the Viz Server Manager is ready. So I'll put it right here. So the Viz Server Manager is ready. Just a side note, if you have a little white mark in your command prompt like this, that is called a hold in Windows, or a pause. Right-click to clear it, or the command won't continue. What you're looking for is Viz Manager is ready. Now I can come back into Active Workspace, close this, and refresh my browser. And you'll see that it's able to pick up on the Viz Pull Assigner as well as the Server Manager. I'm going to go ahead and go out and flip to the author location. And now that I'm in the author location, I'm going to go ahead and test. So I'm going to do a search for 0901 star. And then when this pulls up, I should get something. In this case, it's kind of go big or go home. So I'm just going to open up the whole assembly. And then you can see the whole assemblies here. I'm going to switch to 3D. And you'll see it's initializing the server connection now. And in a moment, it will try and load all 531 lines. And I'll get the connection to the server. So I can visualize my data and work through my different components at the top at this point. Now, there is one setting, if you come in, that Siemens is getting rid of. So in Viewer Options, there is an option to use what's called client or server-side rendering. So I've got mine set to client, so it renders after it is brought down. With Siemens moving to more of an OpenGL platform, they're getting rid of the ability to do server-side rendering and falling more on the browser capabilities as you land at the destination. So my visualization server is now functioning. Everything is good. And we have tested the primary applications of Active Workspace. The only thing that I would recommend doing at this point is cleaning up a little bit. So we're going to come in here and say close all of our files. We're going to file exit out of Visual Studio. I'm going to come in and close my visualization servers because we're going to create them as services. So I'm going to Control C to kill them, to properly shut them down. I'm going to come into my client and I'm going to close that as well. Just make sure it closes. When that client closes, it is a good idea on a server to come into the task manager, go to Java, and what you're looking for is a hung TCCS process that may still be being used by other elements. So some of us like to just kill this if things are hanging on, but if you do destroy this process, you may not get rendering anymore. In our case, I'm about to shut everything down, so I'm going to end that process and close it. I'm going to go ahead and log out of Active Workspace here, sign out, make sure the sign out process works, it does, and then I'm going to go ahead and bookmark this Active Workspace window. They call it Teamcenter. I'm going to call it Active Workspace because it is a different name of a different client. I'm going to go ahead and choose Done. And I've got my Active Workspace. I'm going to move that up to the front here. Deployment Center second, Solar third, and so on and so forth. So in this video, we have gotten the Rich Client working, Active Workspace working. We validated and troubleshooted the indexer component. We have looked at visualization components and got those up and running, tested our FMS system. and whatnot. In the next video, our final video, if we can help it, of this series, we are going to go through and set up the services and kind of restart the box. We're going to make recommendations for things to control on the server as you're getting ready to maybe zip up a VM and send it to somebody. We'll talk to those topics as well. But we thank you for joining us today, and let's move on to the next video.